Hello, it's great to be back at the Polyglot Gathering, the sixth time, bigger than ever. Thanks a lot for coming to the talk. I'm Gareth Popkins. I vlog at howtogetfluent.com about language learning, and you might have seen me running around with this little camera, because I do vlogs as well. And like last year, I am going to do a daily vlog from the gathering. So if you see me approaching you, dive for cover. But they'll be coming out in the next couple of weeks after the end of the event, so do look out for them. 4 fluency principles. There are so many methods when it comes to language learning. Look at all those polyglots. That's here, I think, 2 years ago. There's not one method to learn a language, that's the truth. And some approaches are going to appeal to you more than others. But for all the variety on the surface, I think there are underlying similarities to every language learning success story. I talk to any one of you, I talk to anyone in that crowd, and I've talked to a lot of you, and I think there are real similarities. And in a way, that isn't a surprise. You see, the thing is, when it comes to learning, yes, we're all different, but we're also in many essential ways the same. We all need a lot of input in our target language, that holy grail of comprehensible input, exposure to the language, listening, reading. We all need a lot of output as well, the essential practice without which we'll never be able to speak or write well in our language. And as far as memory is concerned, it's basically the same for all of us. We've all got to encode new vocabulary, new phrases, new chunks, new collocations, new cultural knowledge. We've got to consolidate that knowledge in our memories, and we've got to be able to recall or retrieve it as we need it, fluently and quickly. So in a sense, as language learners, we're all the same. But, of course, how we engage in language learning can be very, very different. And that depends a lot more on our own personality, our aptitudes, motivation, interests, and the circumstances, the changing circumstances in which we find ourselves. Now, thinking about these underlying similarities and the common practices of successful language learners, I want to distill today 4 principles that I think can help us all progress as effectively as possible and keep us on track, whatever we're learning, wherever we are, and whoever we are. So those are my 4 principles, and I'll introduce them now with a few quick practical tips to go with each one. The first one is what I call tune in. Tune in to the language. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, there were 3 prongs to this tuning fork, if you like. Boom, boom. First of all, the soundscape, the obvious one, of the language. Successful language learners take sound seriously, I think. What do we mean by sound? Well, we can start with the individual building block sounds of a language, the elemental sounds, if you like. We're talking phonemes, out of which every language is built. When you start a new language, the new sounds you haven't come across before, such as the eth, the lateral fricative in Welsh, for example, or difficult for me, the u sound in Russian, or the soft and hard consonants in Russian. Maybe the light and dark L's if you're learning Irish or Polish. These can be a challenge, but often, if they're very different from sounds in your own language, you're learning Georgian, for example, all the new consonants, you'll at least be able to hear them. It's much more of a challenge with what we call allophones of the same phoneme in our language, where a distinction is made in your target language, but not in the native language. So I share an apartment with a Catalan, and she has very great difficulty distinguishing between B and V in English. She can't keep her bowels and her vowels apart. In the same way, I have great difficulty with hard and soft consonants, for example, when I'm speaking Russian, much to the amusement of my Russian friends. So that's one level when we're talking about tuning into soundscape. But then also, of course, we're looking at things like stress, tone in languages, obviously, intonation, and connected speech, the way that the sounds change when they're strung together in phrases and sentences. They're garbled, elision, and so on. That's one aspect of the soundscape, tuning in our ears to the new language. But it's more than that. The second prong of the fork is what we call pragmatics, the cultural rules around communication. And for successful communication to take place, these can be almost more important than the grammar of the language. We're talking non-verbal communication, body language, eye contact, scripts for specific situations. What do you say? How do you behave when you arrive at somebody's house? What are the routine greetings that you ask? We ask in English, how are you? We don't actually want to know how you are. We're just saying hello normally. These are things we have to learn, and to be successful language learners, it pays us to take them seriously early on, not actually just in the advanced stages of language learning, because it's all about relationship building at the end of the day. Other things such as how loud, what's the basic volume setting? I go back again to my Catalan housemate. I think there's something in Catalonia that the volume setting is, for default, is slightly higher. I've noticed this on the phone, when she's on the phone, for example, than it is in Britain. The speed that you speak. Are there different registers according to differences in social status between speakers, for example? Is it polite to look somebody in the eye when you're talking to them and shifty not to do so? Or is it disrespectful to look somebody directly in the eye when you're talking to them? Are there taboo topics? This is the second aspect of tuning in. But that takes us into the third, because we're moving from form, if you like, to content, the wider culture of the language. Now, taking this seriously is something which we want to do from the start, but continues really all the way through our language learning journey. For me, one of the biggest tests are newspaper headlines, because you can see a newspaper headline and it may involve a play on words from a well-known phrase in a sitcom 15 years ago. Yeah? And if you don't understand the source and the way it's been used in the headlines, plus it might not be the whole citation, it might just be part of it, then you may understand the words, but you find yourself thinking, I don't know what the message is here. So that's the wider culture. And of course, we're starting with the geography of the country. Look at a map of the country, the language of which you're studying. The number of times I've been desperately looking up a word I just can't understand. It's not in the dictionary. And it turns out it's a place name. It's the third largest city. And I didn't know. Yeah? Things like that, or personal names. References to history, institutions, la rentrée in French, for example. What's this all about? That sort of thing. We want to know about these things, find out about them. It's the same with proverbs and sayings that may be only partially articulated. So on my first slide, I had the headline, trees, ? Wood. Did you notice that? Wrong way? No, right way. So, and there's a phrase in English to know the wood from the trees. That's to say, to be able to see the big picture. If you don't know that, you might wonder what on earth that heading was actually about. So, the wider culture we need to know as well. And now I am tying out Russian wider culture. That's a kulich, a Russian Easter cake at the Orthodox Cathedral in Kensington in London last year. A few practical tips then on this first principle. With the soundscape, focus in early and keep returning to it. Try and resist the temptation to skip that boring first section preface on pronunciation in your textbook. Or if you don't do textbooks, you don't do first chapters, do somehow find a way of paying attention to an overview of the sound differences and focusing on the key new sounds and the distinctions which are made which don't exist in your own language. So it's your vowels and your vowels. Record yourself, that's a good idea. Asking for feedback then from a teacher or a friend, preferably someone who's trained in understanding how the sound system of the language works. And get good enough. Unless you want to work as a spy, with your accent, your pronunciation, your intonation, it doesn't matter. But you want people you're talking to be able to understand you. You don't want it to be a hindrance to comprehension. With pragmatics, you can learn cross-cultural elements. There's some books in the picture there from my own shelf. You can read a lot about this stuff. And you can even be taught to bow, which is what happened in this picture. That's Chris from Actual Fluency learning to do Chinese bows at a language meetup in Edinburgh in January. So you can sort of learn these things to an extent. Make a conscious effort. Don't overdo it. You are who you are, where you come from. And remember, and this is a problem with some of the sort of business-based writing on cross-cultural communication, I think, it tends to generalize, and if you're not careful, you're dealing in stereotypes based on the most powerful groups in the society. Of course, there are huge differences regionally, class, gender, age, and so on, within language groups. But what you can do is decide who you want to model yourself on in terms of the persona, if you like, that you're projecting in your target culture. And then with a wider culture, well, it's just about engaging, isn't it? It's reading, it's listening, it's getting involved then with the culture and the interest that you have, which are reasons for you starting to learn the language. And asking, of course, at the end of the day. Now, talking about your interests and your reasons for learning the language, that brings me to the second principle, which is keeping your language learning relevant. So we've tuned in, we're keeping it now relevant. What do I mean? Well, first of all, be clear on your goals. Why you're learning the language in the long run. You want to get as fluent as you possibly can in Japanese because you want to work as a simultaneous interpreter in the language. Or you have grandchildren who speak Italian and you want to know enough social Italian to be able to connect with them on your visits to them in Italy. Whatever it is, form a clear vision of why you're learning the language. Then you want your path goals, which are your short to medium term goals, maybe 2 months, 3 months, not more than 6 months ahead, which are much more concrete and are going to be connected to specific actionable steps. So keep it relevant to your goal. But remember, of course, none of us are that unique. There's a common core that you need when you're starting a language. The most frequent vocabulary, the most frequent grammatical structures and phrases. Also what I call the toolkit phrases, how to learn about the language in the language. Phrases like, could you say that more slowly, please? What's German for X? Please repeat that. That sort of thing. Collect those. And then there's the advanced common core. Even at the B2, C1 level, there are still new grammatical structures, new highly frequent vocab, which you just need to know. But then, of course, it's the personal relevance. It's talking about yourself and your circumstances from the very beginning when you're starting your first meetings online, perhaps with a teacher or an exchange partner. And then also keeping your vision in view. So if you're into, I don't know, Georgian basket weaving. Do they do basket weaving there? I don't know. You want the vocabulary in that particular area. You're into motor racing, Brazilian motor racing, then you want all the vocab for following that sport, that sort of thing. That's the more personal aspect of relevance. So a few tips for your goals. Consciously work on your vision. Do think, do I really want to learn this language? Am I really up for the journey, for the investment over several years, if not a lifetime, and for the opportunity cost of the things I could have been doing instead of doing that? It pays to think. Be realistic and honest with your circumstances and with yourself. And of course, your reasons why may change over the long term. It's like a kaleidoscope. And you'll probably find the more you get involved in a cultural community, your reasons will actually change and they'll deepen and they'll strengthen, I hope. And then for your path goals, for the next 3 months, the next 2 months, the next 6 months, you can do something like a SMART analysis: specific, actionable, measurable, relevant again, and time-bound. That sort of thing. You can do an analysis. How am I going to spend to maximum effect the next 2 months, for example, to meet my next intermediate goal? I want to be able to read a simple newspaper article, or I want to be able to talk about my hobby in the language, or whatever it is. I want to have read the whole of a novel, for example, for learners in Spanish, whatever it might be. And then for the Common Core, I think, you know, textbooks or an online course or a physical class, if that's for you, don't apologize for it. You know, why reinvent the wheel? Follow a guided course if you think that will help you. Collect your toolkit phrases. Work on your own pet topics and your relevant islands of fluency, the particular areas I mentioned: motor racing, for example. It might be childcare, might be cookery, whatever it is. Learn the vocabulary in those areas. Work on that. Use your one-to-one sessions with a teacher or an exchange partner to practice and to collect phrases in that area. So that's all about keeping it relevant. Next, number 3, is be brain savvy. What do I mean by that? Well, basically, I mean, we do know things now from cognitive science about how we learn most effectively. Now, I'm not a cognitive scientist, but I've read some of the stuff, and that's what I'm going to share with you now. And you can see whether some of these principles are ones you're already applying, whether you could apply them more effectively. Because learning, you know, is about entrenching knowledge or skills deeply and changing our brain, basically. I mentioned it early: learning the memory, getting it into your memory, being able to actively use the language, even developing the muscles and the feel in your mouth for the new sounds. You've got to be realistic about what learning is. Effective learning can be frustrating and awkward. It can feel non-linear. You know, you want to get from A to B, but you end up down, roundabout, shake it all about on the way. Learning does need to feel difficult at times and involve making mistakes. That's good. It shows that you're trying to push the boundaries of what you're trying to do. Providing, of course, you know, it's great to have good feedback as well. Struggle's actually a sign of progress, not a sign of failure. So if it all feels fun, maybe it's not working as well as it might do. That would be my suggestion. Now, there are various practices we can use then. Things like working with material that's just above your current level, what Krashen calls L+1. Interleaving, switching from different tasks. If you've got an hour, do 15 minutes of verb practice, for example, 15 minutes intense listening, 15 minutes revising some flashcards, for example. Apparently is more effective than massed practice. You've got a whole morning, you're just going to do one thing. Spaced recall, of course, for learning vocabulary. And generation of new phrases, trying to use what you've learned. And then getting some good corrective feedback, calibration. Even exams can be good for this. I've used them to help me set my intermediate goals and to make me do more work than I would have otherwise, to be honest, have done on the language, because I would be embarrassed if I flunked the exam. I still do sometimes flunk them. But I, of course, know that just having a certificate doesn't mean that you are necessarily what you claim to be, but it can be useful if you use it as part of a wider language learning journey for motivation for some types of people. Yeah, and I'm certainly one of them. So in practice, well, how can we be brain savvy? With vocab, we can use mnemonic tricks. We've had a talk on this already so far to help us remember the words, to create hooks for them. Remember, though, those only really work effectively for your short-term memory. You have to then recall the vocabulary, practice it in context. So either you are flashcard or gold listing type of person, or you need to get out there and make sure, and ideally you need to get out there and make sure you're reading and using the words that you've learned and the phrases that you've learned. With grammar, I think grammatical overviews and descriptions are great as an initial roadmap when you're starting a language, starting a new topic. After all, deduction is supposed to be good to help us remember things, but on the other hand, we're not children. We can see an overview, and sometimes it's quicker just to have things explained to us. But the fact is, you can learn a Russian declension table, you're not going to be able to speak. So you have to actually practice the language. It's patterns that you can adapt on the fly, on the wing, and those are the things you need to really be practicing. And then you can go back to the theory of the grammar for fine-tuning later on, perhaps, at different stages in your language learning journey. With reading, it's great to have graded reading, as I mentioned already, this L+1 idea, and audio material if you can get it. So just at or slightly above your level can be great. It means that you've got enough context then to work out and to focus on the new words and phrases. And what I certainly find is the further on I get with the language, the more context I've got, the easier actually it gets to remember individual phrases and words, which is really one of the rewards, I think, of getting sort of to the upper intermediate level in a language, isn't it? Audio, as soon as possible, get it up to native speed or perhaps a little bit faster. When you're first starting, a bit slower, of course, is fine to get the sounds. But the fact is, usually if you can't understand something, either it's because of connected speech, the way words are being garbled and eliding, mixing, merging into each other, or it's simply because you don't, and more likely perhaps, because you don't know enough words. So that takes us back to taking vocabulary seriously. If you can get transcripts, and there are lots of ways these days of getting access to transcripts, not least when you're beginning having a textbook, an interesting course book with MP3 audio or an online course, then you can correct yourself, you can do dictation exercises. There are all sorts of ways you can work then with the material to focus during your focus study sessions in your language learning. With reading and writing, speaking and writing, I've already mentioned recording yourselves, but these active skills are the generation side. But remember, with speaking, we're actually not wanting to be too creative. We want to imitate, just like children do, the correct way of saying things. Because if we try and build our own sentences from the theory, we may be understood, but we're unlikely to sound natural, which is again a reason why learning collocations and chunks of language is a really good idea, aside from the fact that it helps you to speak more fluently, more quickly. Don't neglect writing. There's nowhere to hide from written mistakes. You can put on a good performance when you're speaking. It's body language, it's context, and your conversation partner won't be focused necessarily on your mistakes. Hopefully not. They'll be focused on the content of what you've got to say. When you're writing, though, there's nowhere to hide, and that can draw your attention perhaps at the intermediate and upper levels to fossilized mistakes you're making, which when you get to that level, as I know from my Russian, can be pretty embarrassing. Oh, have I been saying that wrong all this time? But better to know than not to know. You can keep a diary. You can do a page turn of a magazine in your first tandem meeting when you're a beginner in a language, or for that matter when you're more advanced, to get topics to talk about what you're seeing in the pictures. Or prepare in, so you can keep a diary, you can use social media. So for example, one of my friends, Kirsten from the Fluent Show, is learning Welsh at the moment, and she has now got an Instagram account in Welsh where she's posting, and I'm trying to help her by responding and making comments in Welsh. That's a great thing to do if you're that sort of person. Or you could start to vlog in the language, which I've also seen learners doing. And make sure you're getting corrective feedback then, as I mentioned before. You can use Google Docs, for example, for real-time correction by your teacher during a lesson, for example. Don't expect teachers to correct for you outside the lesson time if you're not paying them for it. It's not fair. So, you know, you've got to discuss with your teacher how you're going to do that. But what I have done is we've shared a Google Doc, and then they've corrected during the lesson. And I found that particularly useful anyway, because it means I'm focusing in on returning to what I've written and taking in the mistakes. And beware of the dangers of the plateau. That's to say, you know, you get to an upper intermediate level, you can speak well enough, and people will no longer be pointing out the mistakes that you make because you're functionally fluent. But if you want to get higher, then you need to go back consciously to work again, take your game apart and work on the language. And to finish, the fourth principle is utilizing the power of habit and community. Now, the power of habit, first of all. You're tuned in, you're keeping it relevant, and you're using brain-savvy methods in your language learning. But now you've really got to put in the hours. And we are talking hours in language learning, not months. We think in terms of the number of hours you've invested, whether you do it intensively over a few months or extensively over 20 years. You know, it's the hours you put in that count, of exposure, of input, of practice. Vision and motivation are fine, but your moods fluctuate. Don't be a slave to what you had for breakfast. And don't open your emails or check Facebook just before you're going to do some work on your language, because, you know, it may mean you're not going to get into the zone so easily. So enough of goals, enough of fun, yes? Enough of fun, overrated. I want some discipline from you. You've got to put in the hours. You've got to turn up again and again and again and again with your language learning, whether you feel like it or not, in a sense. Now, why is that okay if you want to excel in the law or you want to run a marathon? Yeah, but somehow with language learning, it's all got to be fun all of the time. No, says Dr. Popkins, not necessarily. It's a long journey. Get down to it effectively, as long as you know what you're doing, and what you're doing is effective in terms of the methods that you're using. That's going to help you get along the way. You've got to turn up. So get the language habit, yeah? I like to use regular focused study slots. This is, again, most of you will be doing this. Every day is better than a binge at the weekend. I like 30 minutes, personally. I also try and get lessons on iTalki, for example, for 30 minutes, because the cost of starting is less. Often I find I continue, but if it's only 30 minutes, I can set my timer using Pomodoro. And to take another phrase, I've only given half of you there, appetite comes. So appetite comes with eating. You get into it. You didn't want to start, but you've made it easier for yourself. Also because you've got your path goals clearly set out. You know what your next target is. So for me with the Japanese, I'm supposed to be finishing my textbook before I travel to Fukuoka for the Polyglot conference, for example. That's a motivation for me on the pretty immediate horizon. Much harder to duck out of it, to postpone it to some vague time in the future. Book in lessons and tandems in advance so it's harder to cancel. You're boxed in. On some of the teacher platforms, if you're using an online one-to-one, you know, you lose money if you cancel in less 24 hours. So I often book a 7 a.m. lesson. I'm not happy with my former self at 6:30. By the time it gets to 8, I'm actually thinking, oh, I'm not such a bad guy after all, because I've already got something under my belt for that day. Logging your progress, if that's your sort of personality, can be a useful thing. You build up a track record. I've been logging my progress with Japanese. I was at 27 days out of 31 this month till I arrived at the Polyglot gathering. So I've lost a few days at the end. But you build up a track record. If that's your personality, then you can find that helpful. Beyond the slot, then, use your lost time for those little activities. Doing your flashcards in the bus queue, having the radio on, even if it's native level, for the music of the language. You pick up more and more as time goes when you're in the shower, for example. And then fun activities for downtime. You see, Dr. P does do fun after all. Look at all those colours. How much more exciting do you want me to get? For downtime, when you just don't feel like studying anymore, just put on a cartoon, put on your favourite sitcom, of course, in the language. For variety as well, to you know, exponentially increase the amount of input you're getting in the language. Reading things that are interesting to you. This is all great stuff to do over and above your focused study slot if you want to make serious, rapid progress in your language learning. And finally, this is part of principle 4, really. It's creating community. That's me in there on Lindsay Williams from Lindsay Does Languages at a previous gathering in, I think it's 2015, in the old venue of the gathering in Berlin at the A&O Hotel, in the bar upstairs, if you remember that. That is me, I'm on the screen there, I am being Snapchatted for the first and only time, actually, on Lindsay's rather fine yellow iPhone. Do you remember those coloured iPhones? So they're rather good. So get some sort of community created, and that will depend on your personality type, of course. If you're shy, you can work on it. You can build up your confidence. It's a lot easier said than done, I know that. But then there's your basic settings as well, which are not things you can change, whether you're basically introverted or extroverted. And that, as I understand, is to do with your default brain chemistry. But you can work with the type of personality that you are to create connections, to create social context in which you're using your language. Take the initiative, whether it's informally, with friends and family, with an exchange partner, with other learners in forums, or it's sharing interests. And this is really where it starts to get good, isn't it? Where you're sharing your passion, your interest, your hobby in the language. You can join groups to discuss online, physical groups if there are meetups where you live. And even if you're taking a back seat and not saying much initially, the focus is not on language. The focus is on some other shared interest. And that's when you're among native speakers mainly, sharing a passion and an interest which is not the language. And then suddenly it's like when you first ride off on a bicycle without these stabilizers on the back, without your dad holding the back of the saddle, you're suddenly moving, hey look, you know, and you're forgetting almost that you're doing this in another language. Share your language learning journey, and the power of community will sustain you far more than if you tried to take such a long and at times taxing journey on your own. So that's it. Those are my 4 fluency principles. Remember to tune in to the language with all that that means. Keep it relevant. Be brain savvy in how you're working when you choose to focus in and consciously work on the language. And use the power of habit and community. And that, in my view, looking at people here, talking to people, is how to get fluent. Thank you very much, and good luck on your language learning journey.
Okay, hello. So we got some questions for you. And the first one is, what's the difference between recall and review for learning vocabulary?
Great question. Obviously they overlap. To me at least, if you're passively reviewing, you are not testing your memory to the same degree. So I would say if you're going, for example, with flashcards from your target language into your mother tongue, or the language you're learning through, that's not as effective as seeing a phrase in, for me, English, and then trying to remember, recall actively the material I'm trying to remember. You could also do this with, if you're trying to recall a sentence, you just leave a gap in the sentence. So it's all in your target language, Icelandic, but a couple of words are missing from the sentence. You have to fill those in. That, again, to me, is more of an active recall rather than simply reading the sentence entirely in Icelandic.
Okay, we have one more.
Yeah.
So what are winged words?
What are weak words? Winged words, sorry, yes. These are phrases which come from literature, advertisements, films, which have taken on a life of their own. So and are used in speech constantly by native speakers often. So that's what they are basically. And they are things you won't necessarily understand because they've taken wings and they've flown off if you don't know the cultural reference behind them.
What are examples?
What are examples? Well, that's a good... anybody got any examples? I should have brought a list of examples.
Blood, sweat and tears.
Sorry?
Blood, sweat and tears.
Blood, sweat and tears. That's a good one, yes. Yes. So there are many from the Bible, from Shakespeare and so on in English. From films very often. There was a talk here actually last year about phrases from Russian films which are used, which have become winged words, which was a great talk, yeah. Any more?
Mm-hmm. So if a person wants to learn multiple languages, how many of them would you recommend to learn at the same time and why?
Gosh. Well, do we want serial monogamy, as I always say, or a bit of polygamy? I think serial monogamy is probably better. I'd say get to a good solid intermediate level in one language before you start the next, if possible. That's one piece of advice. Another is if the two languages are close together, that can help, but it can mean that you mix them up. Or if they're associated somehow with each other for you, people always mention Greek and Spanish because they sound similar, then they can become mixed up. But the main thing is, it is possible to learn more than one language at once, but it's all about trade-offs, isn't it? That you have to put in those hours. Yeah, we can use all the techniques we want to have efficiency in how we're using our time, using our downtime and so on, but there's no doubt that if you start a new language, it's going to slow up your work on the other one. Yeah, this is happening to me at the moment with Japanese, which is my main thing. I'm trying to do 30 minutes a day, but I'm also at intermediate level with Basque. I'm doing far less Basque than I was. Now I'm down to two italki lessons a week with teachers and a lot of radio when I'm in the shower, that sort of thing. You know, so it's all about trade-offs, but don't be discouraged, you know, if you want to start doing that, but be realistic. You've got to work out how you're going to fit it all in, yeah? And drop languages, put languages on hold if you want. Somewhere the work that you've done will be there brewing away in the back of your mind, and even if you're only at a very basic level, you probably find it helps a little bit, even if it's a long time later when you start learning again. Any more?
Yes, so we have... some of the people didn't get what is satellite slots.
Satellite slots, I didn't mention that, did I? It was on the slides.
Yeah.
What I meant by that was what I call satellite slots. If you're doing 30 minutes in the morning, say, having a regular time is really useful. If you've got a family and so on, maybe they respect, you know, don't disturb mummy, you know, straight after lunch or something. You're doing a half an hour or whatever it is. Usually it's early morning or late night for people. What I meant by satellite was if you're doing 30, 45 minutes an hour, then take 15 minutes or 10 minutes at a different time in the day just to do some recall or some relatively passive review of what you've been studying. So say you do have 40 minutes a day, it could be more effective to do 30 minutes in the morning and then just to review the material quite lightly, quite passively for the final 10 minutes in the evening before you go to bed, that sort of thing. And I call that a satellite, rather like the moon is turning around the earth. So a small piece that's broken off, as it were, from the main session.
Could you give some tips for how to recover from an extended study slump and recreate habits?
From an extended
study slump?
Slump. Get started again. Get started, basically. As I say, don't give up. We all have times when we put our languages on ice, as it were. Return to your materials. If you were using materials, it is a good idea to return to them unless you feel they were so boring that those were the things that put you off the materials. But just get started again. And for forming habits, this was on the slide as well, and I didn't say it, but start small. So don't set yourself the target of doing, I'm going to do 2 hours Japanese 8 days a week, yeah? I'm going to set myself up for failure. It's better to say, I'm going to do 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 5 days a week. And that for me is much more achievable. It makes me feel more positive. I often overshoot the target. So it's all about playing games with ourselves, isn't it, in a way? And I think that's a good way to go.
How and why did you decide to start How to Get Fluent?
Why did I decide to start How to Get Fluent? I wanted to share my enthusiasm for learning languages, basically, and I also wanted a bit of community accountability. I was mentioning earlier that when you tell people you're going to be sitting an exam or you're starting to learn a language, or I was sharing early on I was doing the Add One challenge, then it again helped to motivate me and keep me going. So there's a large community accountability there, but I basically just love learning languages, finding out about language learning and writing about it. And what I also find is that in doing that, you're forced to sharpen up your own thoughts and your own ideas about the name of the game, as it were. So that's really helped me. And the other thing is then you start to connect with some incredibly impressive people out there in the interweb, as it were, which then becomes a sort of inspiration and a reward in its own right.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Thank you for the lecture. And one more announce that we will take a photo at 12:50 in front of the auditorium where was the opening ceremony.
Okay, thanks a lot, everybody. See you at the photo.